All right, good morning and welcome to the 15th Annual Sentinel Initiative Public Workshop. I really appreciate those of you who are with us in person at the National Press Club, as well as all of those who are joining us online from, looks like by the people who signed up all over the country and also around the world. We really appreciate having you all with us at this very important update meeting and forward-looking meeting for the Sentinel Initiative. I'm Mark McClellan. I'm the director of the Duke-Margolis Center for Health Policy at Duke University. I'm also an independent director on the boards of Johnson & Johnson, Cigna, Alignment Healthcare, and Prognomic. And I have received fees for serving as advisor for Arsenal Capital Partners, Blackstone Life Sciences, and MITRE. We are convening this workshop at Duke-Margolis under a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Our conversation today, while supported through a cooperative agreement with FDA, is definitely not a federal advisory committee. We're not going to be voting, making recommendations, etc. We are going to be discussing a whole host of very important, interesting issues, developments, and further opportunities related to the
sponsors, especially JP Morgan Chase, this year's lead.
This annual workshop, as I said, which is now in its iteration, is an opportunity to gather the members of the Sentinel community, along with leading experts and many interested stakeholders and contributors, to share key developments in the Sentinel Initiative from the past year, as well as to promote engagement and collaboration and look forward as to what's to come. Throughout the discussion, we'll be hearing about impactful research that has informed regulatory decision-making at the FDA and provided important insights to improve public health response efforts and surveillance of vaccines, not only to address COVID-19, but also Mpox, influenza, and RSV, and to provide guidance for healthcare providers and patients trying to get the most out of the medical products that are available. The Sentinel system is also coming to an important milestone, the end of its current 5-year strategic plan, which was announced in 2019. So we're going to hear updates about the Sentinel strategic plan, how has it gone, and also, I think, like I said before, looking ahead to what might be next. We're also going to hear from FDA's international counterparts on the similarities and complementarities of international efforts, building on some of the Sentinel insights and activities, such as the EU's Darwin network. So this workshop is going to provide an important contribution at an important time for the Sentinel community's understanding of what has happened, what the achievements have been, what the new opportunities are for advancement and further modernization of the data infrastructure, methods, and approaches for communicating about Sentinel work, as well as progress made as a result of all these efforts towards safe and effective medicines for Americans and implications worldwide, and how we can build on those activities. Next, I want to review the agenda for the day, the presentations that are coming up. I think that's coming up on the next slide. We're very pleased to be starting today with a keynote presentation from Dr. Janet Woodcock, who's been an instrumental part of this program since the legislative days back in 2007. Next, we're going to be hearing from the Sentinel Initiative leadership with a fireside chat to get a high-level overview of their work during this past year, including where we are on Sentinel's 5-year plan, active surveillance efforts of the National Evaluation System for Health Technology, and the Biologics Effectiveness and Safety Systems, otherwise known as BEST, its vaccine safety monitoring efforts. After that, we're going to be hearing from international regulators involved and will be providing perspectives on their own similar initiatives, including a spotlight on Darwin in the EU. Then we're going to resume the updates from the Sentinel Initiative with operations and coordinating perspectives from both Sentinel System and BEST. They'll be presenting on an array of topics, including contributions to the COVID-19 pandemic response, signal identification enhancements using BEST approaches, and Sentinel's risk identification and analysis, or ARIA system. After lunch, We'll pick back up by diving deeper into some of the best related capabilities, including key activities utilizing their vaccine monitoring infrastructure over this past year. From there, we'll hear more about the Sentinel system from the perspective of the Sentinel Innovation Center on their efforts to build a linked claims electronic health record system infrastructure for pharmacoepidemiology studies. And then after that, after a brief break, we're going to hear from speakers on how the Sentinel Initiative can leverage lessons learned to move beyond COVID-19 and apply these learnings in the case of future outbreaks, public health emergencies. Then before we close, we'll be hearing from a variety of stakeholder perspectives in our session on stakeholder reflections on the Sentinel Initiative. Now, I want to go over on the next slide our statement of independence and some final logistics before we get going. The Margolis Center for Health Policy is part of Duke University. We honor and reflect Duke's policies of academic independence on behalf of our faculty and our scholars. Neither Duke nor the Margolis Center takes partisan positions, but we absolutely encourage everyone to speak their mind and express their opinions on the important issues that we address. And now just one more slide with some reminders before we get to our keynote presentation. Whether you're here with us in person or virtually, we would very much like your contributions to the meeting. There's a Slido Q&A function. It's that square that you have on the screens there. I'm going to pause here and give people a second to take a picture of that. If you send in a Q&A, which could also include a comment, we're going to pass that along to the moderator for each of the sessions, and we and FDA want to make these discussions engaging and responsive to the points that you raise, since the stakeholder community for Sentinel is so important to its overall success. This is a great opportunity for feedback and for making sure we're getting the most out of our time together here today. So please don't hesitate to submit the questions. Same thing for those of you who are joining us online. We'll also try, as time permits, to bring these topics into our panel discussions, all those panels that I talked about just a moment ago. And of course, you can also join our conversations on the platform X, formerly known as Twitter, where you can use the hashtag Sentinel Initiative to participate there on content related to this workshop. Okay, with all of that by way of introduction to our busy day today, I'm very pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Janet Woodcock, who is the Principal Deputy Commissioner of the FDA and a strategic force behind innovative initiatives like this one that have become such an important part of FDA's work and for contributing to the safety and effectiveness of medications. Janet, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Mark, and good morning to everyone, and welcome to this. I did launch the Sentinel Initiative in one of my prior roles as as a CDER director, and I've followed Sentinel's progress very closely over the last 15 years. But Mark, I do remember back in the day when you were commissioner, okay, that's when we started talking about this, because most initiatives like this, you don't just get legislation kind of coming down from the mount, on the tablets or whatever. You have to do a lot of preparatory work for a number of years to get everybody's mind around what you're trying to do. And so that was the work that we did preliminarily that sort of made this come to pass. But it has been 15 years, and so there's a lot of water under the bridge, a lot of successes. I'd like to thank everyone for being here and for being on remotely, and I'd like to also thank Mark and the Duke-Margolis Center for Health Policy for hosting this. So we can provide annual updates, and we can also get feedback. And so to set the stage for today's discussion, let's dial it back to the start of Sentinel. And this is after we talked everybody into the fact that this was possible and a good idea. So we had a 2007 congressional mandate, and then in May 2008, we announced the Sentinel Initiative with a vision of leveraging the electronic health data on a minimum of 100 million patients so that we could conduct active surveillance on drugs after approval. And we really didn't know how this would work. There was a lot of skepticism and so forth, and of course we learned as we went, and we all learned together. Across the intervening 15 years, then, that vision has become a reality with a whole network of data partners and scientific collaborators on hand to address FDA's regulatory questions. So as part of this Sentinel system or network, there are academics and other very accomplished people and data that we can turn to answer specific questions. Whereas before, it used to be a lot like many other things in politics. It was kind of a data-free discussion where people were saying, well, they're adverse events. No, they're not, right? And it would go on and on for years, and we have newspaper headlines and congressional hearings, but nobody would really know what was going on. And so this was a way to really try to get a handle on what was actually happening out there. And so I'd like to thank everyone from the data partners and collaborators who might be online or here today who've helped develop these data systems to support our public health work. It really did take a village, and it brought together so many people from different sectors to work together. And I think that's part of the energy that we've seen over the years. It's been quite exciting. In the last 15 years, though, there have been so many advances in informatics, pharmacoepidemiology, that enable us to better assess the quality of this digital data that we're getting, and also try to figure out how to establish causal links, because causal inference is like the last frontier here. But we've really made progress. There have also been enormous efforts invested in advanced analytics, artificial intelligence, of course everybody knows that now, and curation of the digital record data that represent these are relatively new frontiers in computational analysis. And so we're generating a whole new type of scholar who's working on this. And we're finding a lot more avenues, approaches, and tools that can enable us to utilize real-world data in monitoring post-market safety. So over time, this has grown, and there are more kinds of networks with slightly on different platforms and so forth that support FDA. The Sentinel system, which is primarily used by CDER, but also by CBER somewhat, Biologics Safety and Effectiveness, or BEST system, that is working with CBER's needs, and the NEST, National Evaluation System for Health Technology. I'm so glad it's spelled out here because I can never figure out what acronyms stand for. That's for devices. So we have three different models, and of course we have other models on the outside, and people are working on the outside using slightly different data models and so forth. We had the OMOP partnership, and that also created a data model that has then gone into Odyssey, and so they work on this too. And this might seem like, oh, this is competition and this is bad, but it actually is. I think it's very fruitful and probably converging to some extent. So we'll hear today how the three models in use at FDA, Sentinel, BEST, and NEST, have been able to work with the healthcare industry and the scientific community to set up monitoring and try to accelerate the pace and the impact of the evaluation of post-market safety through the use of the digital data and as it grows. So Mark went over the agenda somewhat. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more in depth. We'll have a fireside chat first and talk about these three systems, right, from leaders that work on these systems. And I think they're going to talk about some of the major developments and milestones, including some of the important regulatory outcomes that have come out of this, as well as how we've improved methodology over time. As Mark said, in 2019, we put out a vision for the future of the Sentinel system in the Sentinel Strategic Plan. So then we're going to hear highlights on how that vision is coming to fruition, and then, because we're going to have to think about the next phase. Okay, so we're trying to execute that against that plan right now, but we're coming up on a 5-year deadline. As an example, though, FDA's Sentinel Innovation Center that was put forth in this 5-year iteration has developed 2 frameworks for improving the generation of real-world evidence when using non-interventional study designs. First, the principled framework is a stepwise causal inference framework to systematically consider key choices in how you design the study and how you do the analysis for non-interventional studies. This framework leverages real-world data based on specification of a target trial protocol. So what are the principles that are principled? Okay. Second, the Sentinel Innovation Center crafted a set of guidelines for using artificial intelligence in the form of natural language processing, assisted chart review. And of course, this is a holy grail. Can we really get information out of there that was reliable and standard, and to create gold standard data and for developing scalable, computable phenotype algorithms. Again, something that we've really wanted to be able to do. And this has helped to make efficient use of the rich digital health record data and using machine learning methods. So you'll hear in depth about these 2 efforts. And today's agenda will also include on the session on international approaches, as Mark said, with a focus on Health Canada and Darwin EU and some of our partners there. And as I said, people may feel that all these disparate efforts are a problem, but really we're converging. That's my sort of, I'm stepping back. I haven't been all in the weeds on this, and I can see all this coming together. Following that session, we'll get an inside perspective from the Operations Coordinating Center for Sentinel System and BEST. And as Mark said, then we're going to, after lunch, we'll hear from BEST about their methodologic advances. We'll then hear from Sentinel Systems' efforts in improving causal inference, something I'm highly interested in, because if anything, there is still of course, in 1962, right, the huge innovation and change was we have to have randomized data, randomized controlled data, right? And that was like a tremendous advance. I can assure you of that because I went back and looked at old NDAs before that time, and their efficacy data was like, well, a doctor in Germany, I swear this is true, okay, a doctor in Germany gave this drug, this was one of the estrogen, gave it to some postmenopausal women, and they really liked it. And then the other piece of evidence was a doctor in Mexico gave it in his clinic to some women, and they also really liked it. So the idea that we would have randomized, blinded, trials, controlled trials, and that we would use statistical inference testing and so forth was a tremendous advance. But then that has become kind of solidified as the only method of discerning truth. And we've got to get away from that because we can't answer all the questions that way. We don't have enough resources to do that. And we actually can't experiment with people and see how many get adverse events and so forth. So, we have to use other methods. And yet we need to stop arguing about it and try to make these methods as reliable as we can. And that's what this has been about. So then we're going to hear lessons learned from COVID, and some of the lessons learned, unfortunately, is that other countries with better national health system actually can get answers quicker than we can at the moment, and so we have to work on that. So before we delve into the session, before you get the session started, I'd like to take a few minutes to mention some of the regulatory work conducted in the Sentinel system. Because I will say we had kind of a naive idea at the beginning, Mark. We were thinking active surveillance, we'd just be like some kind of deity floating above, and all this data would flow in, and we'd know, and it turns out, what we really use is this for, to a great extent, is, okay, somebody says this drug causes something, or it causes something in a greater frequency than what we thought, or something like that. There's some signal, and we can evaluate that rather than, like I said, arguing about it for the next 5 years. So since the implementation of the Sentinel system five-year strategic plan in 2019, the system has done over about 367 analyses of different drug problems. This has helped FDA evaluate safety signals and inform our regulatory decision making. So that means we update labels because we have some actual data about that, rather than saying 5 reports have come in about this, right? It's not very informative to the clinical community. We've supported advisory committee deliberations. It's helped us with the REMS and figuring out, what we should do about a REMS, and helped us respond to submissions from sponsors. For example, we assessed rates of ischemic colitis among female users of allocetrol and hydrochloride. And I was involved in this. This was giant brouhaha about irritable bowel syndrome. Allocetrol had a REMS in place to mitigate the risk of ischemic colitis and severe constipation complications. The Sentinel study found the rate of ischemic colitis was consistent with what was found in the prescribing information. So it had nailed it. This supported FDA's decision this September to release the REMS because prescribers had the adequate and accurate information that they needed about that side effect. And it was determined that having a REMS was no longer necessary to ensure benefits outweighed risks. We also conducted a study on patients treated with direct oral anticoagulants versus warfarin and the risk of cutaneous small vessel vasculitis. And this is the kind of signal, that we would previously just have had controversy about for a very long time. But the study didn't find a statistically significant increase in risk amongst users with DOACs versus warfarin, or even among different DOACs. The FDA determined no regulatory action was needed. And I mention this in particular because the Sentinel studies may provide FDA with reassuring safety information that results in a decision that no regulatory action is needed. And importantly, this helps the patients on these drugs and the prescribers feel more comfortable, right, that we actually have a grip on this and they're not dealing with an unknown risk. These reassuring studies tend to get less attention from the press and so forth because they show there isn't an increased risk, right? But they're so valuable for the prescribing community and for the FDA. And we've continued to engage Sentinel to respond to COVID, supporting both regulatory decision-making and contributing to scientific knowledge more broadly. Recovery trials and other trials suggested there was benefit from using dexamethasone in severely ill hospitalized patients with COVID, right? But potential harm in the people who didn't need oxygen supplementation. And actually, I called Gerald about this because I heard anecdotal reports that people were giving, as a result of their reading in the recovery study, they were giving outpatients with new onset COVID dexamethasone or other corticosteroids to people who had an active viral infection, okay? And probably for other reasons too, FDA investigated use of dexamethasone using a Sentinel system and presented initial results to the NIH treatment guidelines panel in April, and more recently, updated analyses were published in JAMA in April 22. The CDC subsequently issued a health advisory citing the Sentinel study to alert physicians and the public that systemic corticosteroids are not recommended in people with mild to moderate COVID-19 who don't require supplemental oxygen. And hopefully that has been taken to heart by prescribers, because I think this is a practice that probably could tip a lot of people over, especially people with different types of diabetes. that was something, that's a very concrete example of the kind of thing we could do. We could find out how prevalent this use was and then warn people. FDA also leverages Sentinel infrastructure and lessons learned to help establish international collaborations with other regulatory authorities and data networks. Health Canada and research at the Canadian Network for Observational Drug Effects Studies, CNODES, have adopted the Sentinel's common data model and analytic approaches so they can also run analyses in parallel with the FDA. And we'll be hearing more about Health Canada work today. Similar in Denmark, their databases have been formatted in the Sentinel Common Data Model for joint analyses. And so, as I said, there's some sort of convergence coming together here. That's very good because nothing like replication in a separate data set and a separate type of method to give you comfort in the reliability of the result. And the Taiwan Ministry of Science and Technology's funded transformation of the National Health Insurance Research Database, which includes longitudinal claims data with information over 23 million individuals, into the Sentinel Common Data Model. So I think that shows some real progress internationally. And I also want to briefly touch on, and I don't want to take up too much time, on the regulatory work conducted in BEST. CBER's BEST system was launched in 2017 as part of the Sentinel initiative to expand and enhance CBER's access to new data sources to conduct surveillance and epidemiologic studies of biologic products. And CBER, as part of their work on COVID, CBER conducted a retrospective cohort study using a study population generated from 4 administrative claims databases in BEST, and that included all individuals who received at least 1 dose of a COVID-19 mRNA vaccine. And they looked at the primary outcome of myocarditis and pericarditis, or both, between 1 and 7 days post-vaccination. And then they compared that, of course, to historical cohorts. And an increased risk of myocarditis and pericarditis was observed after COVID-19 mRNA vaccination, highest in men aged 18 to 25 years after a second dose of the vaccine. But the incidence we were able to nail down pretty well in the United States was mild. They were generally mild and resolved without lasting effects. And this was, of course, replicated in international studies as well. And so we had great confidence in these estimates. And this BEST study, along with a positive benefit-risk profile, continued to support vaccination using the mRNA vaccines. So that was a really important study because we heard a lot. I heard a lot about the pericarditis and so forth. You'll be hearing more about BEST work in the sessions to come. So wrapping up, the Sentinel system, BEST, and NEST are several of FDA's many initiatives that have been developed to drive innovation and incorporate new technologies into everything we do to protect public health. In this landscape of accelerated growth of informatics and pharmacoepidemiology capabilities, this can only evolve along with the evolution of all our partners and stakeholders. And we get increasingly rich data sources as time goes on. By attending today's workshop, either virtually or in person, you're expressing your continued interest in being part of this journey as Sentinel, BEST, and NEST continue to evolve and develop to meet our needs while leveraging these rapidly advancing capabilities. So let's hear some of the progress and innovation that will be described in today's presentations, and thanks very much.
Janet, thanks very much for that keynote covering this whole increasingly rich arc of the Sentinel initiative, as well as touching on a lot of areas where Sentinel is having impact across the spectrum of medical products. We're going to turn to hearing more about that the rest of the day, starting right now with our opening Fireside Chat. So I'd like to ask our presenters to come on up to the stage. Steve Anderson, I think there is a sequence here, right? So Steve Anderson, Director of the Office of Biostatistics and Epidemiology at FDA's Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. Gerald Dolpan, Director of the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology at FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. And Denitsa Marinats-Dabish, who's Associate Director of the Office of Clinical Evidence and Analysis at FDA's Center for Devices and Radiological Health. And Steve, I think we're starting with your opening remarks, and then to Gerald and Denitsa, and then we're going to get into some discussion. And send in those questions, remember?
So do I take the stand, or do I?
I think you can.
Right from the desk?
Preference? Does that mean stand up, or does that mean stay there? That means stay there. Okay.
Okay. I don't have any slides, so. So good morning, everybody. So first, I wanted to thank the audience for their participation in this event. 15 years is a long time that we've been doing this. I was going to share some updates from CBER about accomplishments during the last year, but then sort of what we're looking forward to in the coming year as far as surveillance, and then longer into the future. It'll be a high-level overview, previewing some of the topics that will be presented in later sessions. So during the pandemic, about 90% of what we were doing was really related to COVID pandemic vaccines. So just to sort of jump into those, we really divided our studies into three major populations, and that was the 65 years of age and older, 18 to 64 years of age, and then under 18 years of age, the pediatric population. So more this last year, there's been a focus on the pediatric populations. We've done several studies very recently. So there have been authorizations of the vaccine last summer and in 2022, not 2023. But this expanded our near real-time surveillance, pediatric surveillance, to include the Pfizer-BioNTech and then the Moderna, both the primary and monovalent boosters, COVID doses in those 6 to 17 years of age, and 6 months to 17 years of age, and then the Novavax vaccine for 12 to 17 years of age. So with that, what we do is we would study 21 outcomes and conduct additional signal evaluation when we identified a signal of concern, a statistical signal. And in that case, we identified a seizure signal, which we're still following up on. So that's one thing that has come of that, which is we've identified a new signal for this seizure outcome. We continued studies using near real-time surveillance with one observer as expected, as Dr. Woodcock mentioned, looking at myocarditis, pericarditis in mostly males, and that started at 18 to 30 years of age, and then another outcome, which was anaphylaxis. So I just wanted to add to what Dr. Woodcock said was we conducted on the 18 to 30-year-old population, the regulatory impact of that was that we conducted a quantitative benefit risk assessment that we did publish, and that information was used as we were trying to make decisions about the pediatric vaccines, because as you'll recall, there was a swirl in the news about, well, the risk isn't as great to children, so we wanted to look at that very carefully in a quantitative, measured way using data from this study. So that was one piece of data, not the only piece of data. There were clinical trial data and others, but used to help inform decision making. So next was in the fall, later in the fall and winter of 2022, I think we all remember that there were FDA authorized 2 bivalent COVID-19 mRNA booster vaccines, and that was made of the original COVID strain plus the Omicron BA.4/5 strain. And that was also for populations 6 months of age and older. We conducted near real-time surveillance of all the populations in that case, all the pediatric populations, adult and then older adult populations as well. I also wanted to say in early 23, earlier this year, we identified, or CDC identified, a signal for ischemic stroke following the bivalent Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine among persons 65 years of age and older. And so what we did with that was do follow-up, so we're doing a self-controlled analysis that continues on to this day because we kind of have to keep on digging into the data on that. We didn't identify or verify that stroke signal. We couldn't find consistent evidence that stroke signal was a true safety concern, but there's more to come as far as analyses on concomitant vaccines that were given at the same time. So again, and those concomitant vaccines really largely influenza vaccines. So I think one of the things you can see is just sort of regulatory implications go into decision making. These things go into labeling too if we do verify in our self-controlled studies or more robust studies that we do indeed have a signal. I wanted to just go on to some other safety work in the past year. So last year we were just sort of starting into work on Mpox. And that, at least for Mpox, there is a approved vaccine, and that's the Unios vaccine. So we monitored 11 health outcomes for that. We did IIS linkages too. Those are the vaccine registries at state and some of the jurisdictions, meaning large cities, and 2 or 3 states like California have actually 3 IISs that need to be linked up. But that linkage was critical for us to do Mpox studies because that data was coming from public health organizations, meaning the state and local level public health agencies. And that wasn't being captured in our databases. But by having this linked data, it enabled us to capture that data more effectively to evaluate safety. And those studies are still just completing at this time. So overall, I just wanted to give a thumbnail sketch because I've talked about and touched on a lot. We've done 15 or more large safety or effectiveness studies with 10 protocols that we posted to our bestinitiative.org website. We've had several addendas posted as well, approximately 15 posted or published papers in the last year, and approximately 30 or 40 meeting presentations and abstracts. And again, all of this feeds into our regulatory work, informing regulatory decisions. So you're going to hear more about all of that work or parts of that work in the presentations this afternoon. I did want to say a bit about our infrastructure, and I wanted to say that we do have more than 100 million patients covered in the databases that we use. We use large health plan databases, which include Carelon, CVS Health, and then Optum. And that really covers mostly we call it 0 to 64-year-old population, so our pediatric and our adult population. And then our older persons population, 65 and older, is covered using CMS data. And I wanted to thank CMS for their partnership with us. I wanted to thank also Acumen, who's been sort of our coordinating center lead, has been useful, helpful in basically moving along the studies that you'll hear about today. Just moving on to just the expansion of the best data infrastructure to enhance our surveillance capabilities, I wanted to mention some of our work on linking registries. So at this time we have, I think, around 35 registries linked out of 64 to the health plan databases. So that's been a very useful activity. We're going to continue that in future years, but I think this linkage process is something that really is important overall to link data together to get more power to identify. We're probably identifying 20 to 60% more vaccinations through that approach. So I think it's a very valuable, important approach. So just sort of in addition to that work, we've also been doing work to evaluate vaccination during pregnancy as well and other biologic products used during pregnancy. So we've completed infrastructure work to kind of link mothers and infants to the products, whether it's a vaccination or some other biologic product that might be given during pregnancy. So that infrastructure has been built, and we're just starting to use it on formal studies. We have several vaccine effectiveness studies. Vaccine effectiveness is a huge issue. Just to sort of go through just quickly, we have a pediatric vaccine safety study in the 5 to 17-year-old population, a booster vaccine effectiveness study utilizing Optum and CVS health data in the 12 to 64-year-old population. We have data, again, using partner data from Optum and CVS Health in the 18 to 64-year-old population. And we also conducted a large vaccine effectiveness study in nursing home population using the CMS data. So you'll hear more about those studies. So finally, I just wanted to touch on a few things. Odyssey was mentioned here, so I just wanted to mention our Community Engagement and Development Initiative, or SETI, with Odyssey. The purpose of that relationship is to foster outreach with the scientific community. Right now, we're using it largely to do methods research and then some surveillance activities as well. This included some methods development projects and a seminar series. That sort of effort slowed down during the pandemic because we had to switch all of our resources into surveillance monitoring, so we're hoping to pick that up in the coming year. So priorities for the coming year, I just wanted to mention we're heading into, well, I used to say heading into the fall, but we're now fully into the fall, and 2 new respiratory syncytial virus vaccines, or RSV vaccines, which is easier to say, and a new COVID vaccine, and then new influenza formulation have all been approved. So we're currently undertaking efforts to monitor those. So not to sort of sit on our laurels and say we've done a lot with the methods that we have, but we're completely switching over methods from using the MAX SPRT methodology, which has some limitations, to doing sort of a screening, self-controlled methods approach, taking only 2 looks at the data, sort of in the middle of the uptake of the vaccine and then at the end of the uptake of the period of the vaccine. That will save us as far as we're hoping. It'll reduce confounding and bias that we might have, but it'll also help us sort of, we're hoping, reduce some of the false positives, false signals that we see as well. So again, just that's another innovation. It also introduces efficiencies because we're only taking 2 looks. We're not taking monthly looks for 6 months or 12 months, which is a lot of effort. So we're trying to cut down on the number of looks we're doing too. I think I will stop there because that's quite a bit.
That is quite a lot of information, and thanks for summarizing a huge amount of work going on in conjunction with BEST and looking forward as well. So next, I'd like to turn to Gerald.
Right, so thanks, Mark. Thanks, Steve, for that overview. And thank you all for joining us today here. So it's been a busy year for Sentinel as well. And in 2019, we established a 5-year plan, the 5-year strategic plan. We published this. And a key area of this plan was to expand our use of electronic health record data. We were relying on, and frankly, we continue to rely on, claims data. We wanted to enrich that with the electronic health records. So we established the Sentinel Innovation Center in 2019, and the goal, the remit of the Innovation Center was to identify, develop, and evaluate new methods, innovative methods to address drug safety using the electronic health record data. And they've launched a series of projects, each building on prior work, to fill gaps we had with the claims data, and to basically refine our capabilities to use these data. So you'll hear more about that later from Sebastian Schneeweiss, but let me just give you an overview of the framework that we established when we set up the IC. First is the data infrastructure, so building a network of linked claims, EHRs, with at least 10 million lives. So much lower than the 100 million we have much more than 100 million with claims, but the linkage is to start with, we've started with 10 million, and hopefully that will grow. Then there's feature engineering, which is new methods to include machine learning, artificial intelligence, natural language processing to enable computable phenotypes. So can we use the electronic data and other data using electronic computer methods to actually identify patients or outcomes that have certain predefined characteristics, including not only the structured data, but importantly the unstructured data, which often have a lot of the rich information we're looking for. So now that we have the medicines and the outcomes and the clinical features, causal inference. How can we establish a relationship, if one exists, between the medicine and the outcome? And so the third focus area for the IC has been causal inference, and to identify the specific challenges when using EHRs, how to handle missing data, and different calibration methods for confounding adjustment. So you'll hear more about that. And then a different aspect of using these data would be detection analytics. As Janet mentioned, this ongoing active surveillance, what kind of signal detection methods can we develop and are developing to account for and leverage differences in EHRs versus claims. We've instituted a tree scan using the claims data, but now we want to take that a step further and develop detection analytics using the EHRs. So with each year, the Innovation Center has been making more and more progress in these areas, and I think in the coming year, I think you'll hear a lot more about the fruits of these efforts. The IC is also initiating a bunch of other projects this year. They're scoping major state and regional health information exchanges to identify their potential utility in increasing our access to these kinds of data. They're doing a lot more work on propensity score modeling for causal inference, ultra-high dimensional propensity scores. I last heard about high dimensional. Now I guess we're getting into ultra-high dimensional, so this might be a whole new dimension of things. Incorporating some of these engineering features from EHRs into the Sentinel Common Data Model, and then identifying health outcomes of interest where our active risk identification and analysis system based on claims has not been able to answer questions. Can we expand the scope of outcomes that we are interested in by leveraging the data, the unstructured data, really from the EHRs? And then, of course, more work on confounder evaluation and balancing. So you'll hear a lot more of that later today from Sebastian. He'll talk about that. We also, in our 5-year plan, wanted to create a national resource by broadening the Sentinel user base. And so we established a Community Building and Outreach Center, or CBOC, in 2019. And they've created an outreach newsletter, put together educational slide decks, videos, webinars, updated and improved the website, and they've looked at, we've looked at other partnership opportunities. So we'll hear more about them later today as well. And parallel with these efforts, we've been continue our work with the Sentinel Operations Center. That's the group that actually does the analyses of the ongoing safety issues, and we've been working them, for over 10 years to deliver the analyses that inform our work. So from 2016, when we really put this system into operation, through 2029, the SOC supported 133 unique safety concerns that FDA identified using the Active Risk Identification Analysis, or ARIA system. And in 22 of those cases, we were able to avoid having the company conduct its own safety evaluation. Of these 133, 12 of them from Sentinel informed labeling, 11 informed advisory committee deliberations, 5 were the basis of FDA drug safety communications, 3 informed our feasibility or utility of conducting post-marketing studies, and 17 helped us determine that no regulatory action was needed. And I think Janet alluded to the important role that those kinds of determinations make. We have a lot of information on the Sentinel website, so if you're interested in more about the scope of these things, I encourage you to look there. We also, like Steve and Bast, have presented a lot of our work. There's been a lot of publications. For those of you who are familiar with the ICB, the International Conference of Pharmacoepi meeting, we had a symposium, a lightning presentation, a spotlight poster, 5 oral presentations, and 10 other posters. So we're getting our work out there as well. And you'll hear more about the SOC later today. We did a lot of work with COVID too. I won't outline all of it, but I think some of the bigger things we did were look at the natural history of coagulopathy and thrombosis and compared that to influenza. That work was published in JAMA. And then Janet mentioned the really impactful work that we did with dexamethasone, impactful in the sense that NIH picked it up, CDC picked it up. Mari Bradley, who's here today, was really championed that work for us, and it showed that we can really learn about how medicines are used and how that use can contribute to unsafe practices. It's not simply forming a causal relationship between a drug and an adverse event, but seeing how medicines are used in the population is also important for us as well. I want to briefly touch on the future of Sentinel. For those of you who follow our contracting cycles, you know that we'd normally be coming to an end of our 5-year cycle on September 30th, 2024, so about 11 months from now. And we would be preparing to release a request for proposal to recompete the contract during fiscal year 24, which is the fiscal year we're in now. We've decided to postpone that for a year until fiscal year 25, and this will allow us to take the learnings that are accruing from the Innovation Center and elsewhere so that we can develop all the technical requirements to enhance the data and service package available to FDA as we look to the future of the Sentinel system. Like Steve, I want to thank all our partners in this. We don't do this work alone. In fact, we have a wide network of partners, our partners at Harvard Pilgrim, our partners at Brigham, our partners at Deloitte, the network of data providers behind them, and the network of academics that work with them to advance this science. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Denitsa from CDRH.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I am super delighted to be here to share with you some of the news from the device space. As Dr. Woodcock mentioned earlier, we have a slightly different model in terms of how we were thinking about development of the national system, but it's still under the auspices of the full Sentinel initiative and the philosophy of what FDA should be doing in terms of establishment of the evaluation system for medical products. Device space is very different from drugs and biologics, both in the sense of the diversity of the medical products that we regulate, ranging from implantable devices to capital equipment to diagnostic devices to software as a medical device. So as you can appreciate, it did necessitate thinking about how this system would look like. And be different to be able to capture that diverse set of products that we regulate. From other perspective, we've also looked very critically into what exists nationally in terms of the existing infrastructure. We were fortunate enough that many of the national professional societies worked very hard to establish the national registries that capture a lot of products that are used in the implantable, in the interventional care. So that was another starting point that we really wanted to plug in and take a full advantage of what's captured already to be able to add the layers of, I would say, higher expectations that these registries would evolve into something that ultimately will be used in this system. So in having sort of these thoughts in mind, back in 2012, the idea was launched about the need that we have to establish the National Evaluation System for Health Technology. And at that time, the first consortium called Medical Device Innovation Consortium was formed using the cooperative agreement between the FDA and establishing this through a public-private partnership with that consortium, which had the sole purpose of advancing the regulatory science across the entire life cycle. So again, from the beginning, it was an idea really that this is not going to be just the post-market surveillance system, but rather the system that will have a place in the entire evaluation system for devices that we regulate. At that time, the planning board was launched, and also National Medical Device Task Force was launched and commissioned by the FDA, comprised by the national thought leaders, to try to figure out what would be the best way and how the fastest ways to establish such a system. So they put together the reports, and in 2016, the NEST Coordinating Center was established as one of the programs within Medical Device Innovation Consortium, with the goal that this become a national resource that will bring the entire post-market and pre-market stakeholders from the medical device space together, from patients, from industry, from professional societies, from academia, from FDA, and that we are going to be working together to identify major programs that will fill in and respond to the gaps that exist at the time. That still exist, I'd say. I'd like to talk a little bit about what have been accomplished since that time, because National Evaluation System for Health Technology Coordinating Center had taken really very aggressive steps toward advancing that TPLC, Total Product Life Cycle philosophy throughout the entire process. So they first convened the working groups that centered around quality of data sources that will be acceptable to be part of this national system. They also convened the working group that was focusing on methodology. And again, both of these working groups provided, both of these working groups established the frameworks and published the frameworks that kept not just informed and educated, but also attracted the stakeholder community to be part of the NEST. There was also effort to establish the research network, which grew out of not just health systems, but also national registries, strategically coordinated registry networks, academic sites that had a stake in and expertise in working in the medical device space. And currently, such networks has access to 160, a little bit over 160 million patients, captures the experience across over 260 health systems and clinical sites, and also over 20,000 practices across the United States. So there's still a lot of work, obviously, to be done, but the community started coming together to try to harmonize what is being collected in those data sources to be able to actually work together. Now, NEST, as I mentioned, has these sort of, I would say, two major work streams. One is focusing on, as they like to call it, NEST Marketplace, which is really an infrastructure of building together and bringing together the data sources, the vendors, the actual thought leaders, the industry, health systems, payers, and others, to be able to come together in one marketplace, to be able to, in fact, produce what they call the marketplace sort of mark of approval, meaning that it's a high quality to be meeting regulatory grade that FDA would need in order to make our decisions. So again, that's focusing primarily on the pre-market setting. Obviously, there is a lot of, after the 21st century cures, gave us a lot of I would say wind into the wings in terms of using real-world evidence, although in CDRH we've been using it way before. In fact, we were mandated to use it, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But the idea is that in that marketplace, there will be, that mark of approval would mean that the companies and the vendors that will helping them actually produce the real-world evidence in a better, faster, and less costly way, they're going to be able to do that in a much more effective way if these data sources are of a highest quality, that produce that are using the platforms that can effectively lead to analysis and use the most sophisticated analytical approaches, obviously all in the name of our patients in the United States having the access to the high quality medical devices first in the world. So that's one major, I would say, vertical within the NEST Coordinating Center, and we are obviously a lot of, we are part of that, and FDA actually is very active working together with the Nest Coordinating Center. The other aspect focuses on active surveillance, and I think this is probably of most interest to today's audience. For those of you who would like to learn more about, what's currently out there, there is a set of RFIs and RFPs, put forward this year in order to solicit the input of how this active surveillance should look like and what current capacities we have. As a matter of fact, we are very close to actually making decisions about partners in the context of active surveillance effort, and those who will be actually taking it to the next level in terms of leveraging existing Nest Coordinating Center platforms, but also adding much more into methodological approaches in utilizing novel tools, novel methodologies in order to leverage the current surveillance system that exists in sort of silos across the country, but not necessarily as a system. I'd like also to talk about another, I would say, unique feature in the device space that is very much part of the larger Nest vision. In fact, it's one node within the Nest, and it's called Strategically Coordinated Registry Networks. As I mentioned, in the device space, we actually have this luxury to be able to leverage what's out there in the national fabric of our country and internationally. And try to figure out how to, from those legacy registries, we can actually create more of a strategic approach, how these registries can be harmonized across what they collect in terms of minimum core data element set, in terms of linkages between the registries and electronic health records and the claims data, and what, in fact, can be, how this can be part of the evolving national infrastructure through Nest. We were fortunate to be receiving actually funding from the Office of the Secretary of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation and HHS through their PCOR Trust Fund program to pilot some of these efforts, to actually paint the road of how the legacy registry that originally was set up to potentially collect all information through the maybe hospital stay of the patient that receive a particular intervention, let's say vascular surgery, to something that will be then linked to other data sources to paint the whole journey of that patient nationally, and to try to, in fact, create the ways of how the data can be collected faster, better, and in less costly way. So we'll hear today at the last session one example that will come from Dartmouth, where one of our partners, Dr. Phil Goodney, who is a vascular surgeon, will talk about what sort of successes we've achieved in that, utilizing the vascular case as an example. I'll just summarize it here briefly, and I'm sure he's going to do a little bit more in terms of the what sort of regulatory decisions are going to be made based on that infrastructure. But I'd like to say that, at the beginning we've started with this Vascular Quality Initiative registry, which currently has a little bit over 1 million patients across the nation, and collecting information on over 200 different types of devices that are used in the vascular space, in carotid, peripheral vasculars, and others. So again, it started as a small effort funded by the AHRQ a decade ago, and then grew out into the major quality improvement initiative, which was embraced by the Society of Vascular Surgeons. And again, they collected information on a short follow-up period of time, but this is where the funding from ESPI came in, and the entire medical device epidemiology network as a public-private partnership worked together to, in fact, create a vision and implement that vision, that we are able to actually link the data from the vascular registry for all the patients in the registry with the data for Medicare. And again, because those are elderly patients, we actually 95 or 98% of the patients in the registries are of that age. So we were able actually to achieve 15 years of follow-up of the data, which for the FDA opened up a whole new door in terms of how we can utilize this infrastructure for nesting our required post-market studies in there, and in fact, potentially thinking about nesting some of the pre-market clinical trials in this type of registry. Then we started also experimenting what happened with the, let's say, what's happened with the under 68, since the age 65 patients. So we actually started linking to that registry data that came from Sparks data in New York or OSHPD in California, two largest states that in fact have these all-payer claims databases in them. Then we also added some clinical trials data. We also added to that, manufacturers joined and actually donated the data from their clinical trials to this infrastructure. So the point being is, in the device space, we do have this opportunity to actually build and be very much built in the fabric that our clinicians across the country are already using, and they are. CMS is using it for coverage with evidence development decisions, and others in academia are using it for piloting a number of research studies. And on the us on the regulatory side really wanted to add that additional rigor to the quality of the data and longitudinality to it so that we can be able to use it in the regulatory setting. I also would like to say that over the course of the past 10 years, FDA made over 90 regulatory decisions that is based on the real-world evidence. And you've seen probably the report that we publicized last year, which means that even before we were asked to do or requested to do through the 21st Century Cures Act, there had been that opportunity in the device space to rely heavily on the real-world evidence. So NEST will capitalize on this infrastructure, adding to it certainly effort on EHRs, on a linkage between claims data and EHRs, because not every device can be, in fact, I would say not every device should be in the registry, but again, if there are devices that we can utilize the registry infrastructure, we should. And finally, I would like to conclude with the following. This model is self-sustainable, no longer relies on FDA funding, although NEST is funded through reauthorization of MEDUFA. Certainly, there is funding from industry that goes there. But it's important to say that the reason why it's working is because it brings value. We've recently done and published in British Medical Journal two papers that examine the return on investment for manufacturers if they utilize these national registries that are set out there without actually industry's funding, and add some funding to make their required post-market studies being executed. So basically, 3 companies in the cardiac space, Edwards Life Sciences, Medtronic, and Abbott, over the course of 8 years, benefited immensely from utilizing the TVT registry, which is part of NCDR suite of registries, by nesting their required post-market studies in the registry. So based on that data, we made 23 regulatory decisions at CDRH. If each company conducted their particular study one-off, collectively these 3 companies for these 23 decisions would have paid over $126 million. So what happened instead, these 23 decisions cost the companies only a little bit over $20 million, which led to the 550% of return on investment. And we had repeated similar return on investment analysis in a vascular space, abdominal hernia space, and in fact, industry published with us these efforts, meaning that really is something that brings value to them. So again, I'd like to conclude here. I'm sure there are going to be questions later, but I wanted to say that we look at Sentinel as sort of older brother that we can learn from, and we do learn a lot. There are lots of methodological advances, both from the academic partners and our colleagues in CBER and CDER. We'd like to leverage all the lessons that we learned through Sentinel, but we also needed to apply them in a space that's a little bit more diverse and has uniqueness. NEST is evolving as a solution with a compilation of tools and partnership, and with NEST Coordinating Center leadership that we work together very closely. we hope to achieve that goal, and I hope that at the next annual meeting of Sentinel, we'll be able actually to report back on active surveillance successes and marketplace successes by NEST.
Great, Denitza, thank you very much. And I have to say, yeah, that's a hand for this fireside chat. You all each had a tremendous amount of the big picture to cover here, given how much is going on with this overall program. I do want to thank the people who have sent in questions already. Given our limited time, I'm going to try to consolidate a few, but I do want you to encourage sending them in, looking at some of what's come in. We're going to hear more detail about a lot of the topics that came up in this session now in the sessions that come up. So if we don't get to all of them now, we're gonna carry them over. But one big picture question for each of you in our 5 minutes left. It seems like Sentinel has really evolved into this kind of rich, I like the sort of the family analogy there, speaking as an older brother myself. My younger brothers have kind of different interests and needs, but we do try to work together when we can, and there's some common underlying themes in the Sentinel program too. One of them that came up repeatedly today is just how much richer and more extensive data are getting to support these efforts. That's something that all three of you mentioned, integrating registry data with claims data and really expanding the use of electronic record data. And I think it's fair to say, based on what I've seen in Sentinel, getting to more data collected directly from patients and things like that as part of the programs in the future too. So nesting, integration, Nest is a good name, Denitza. But then also methods are improving as well, where people are talking extensively, which was not the case 15, 10, maybe even 5 years ago, about things like causal inference, effectiveness studies, integration with other types of post-market evidence questions. So if I could ask each of you very briefly, maybe reflect on this. Steve, you talked about a lot of work that's been focused on vaccine safety, understandably, in the COVID context, and now with a number of new vaccines coming along, that's been driven by integrating IIS registry data from state public health with claims. But now it sounds like other areas we're trying to do integrated data and EHRs, and you're moving into effectiveness studies.
Right.
Is that all right? Anything you'd like to add about the trajectory here?
That's all right, and I think for our kind of next steps is really integrate. So I'll say this at the end, the last session, because I'm in that as well. Is really the message is integration, 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 because we've just done this one set of integrations with IIS data and claims data, but certainly next bring in EHR, even bring in adverse event reporting systems and other types of data. As Denitza, I think, is doing too, where you can kind of have a more fuller appreciation of the patient encounter and the adverse events that you identify. So I think that's going to be powerful. It will take a huge amount of effort to set up, though.
Yeah, but a lot of synergies kind of driving them. And Gerald, you talked about moving, as Janet did. Initially, it was sort of signal confirmation or evaluation, but you talked about signal detection. You talked about causal inference. I know there's been a lot of methods development that's applying elsewhere in observational real-world research coming out of your work. And anything you'd like to add about what seems like some very important trends in similar directions there?
I think it's a lot what Steve said. It's really integrating these various sources of data. Claims gives us, for insured patients, it gives us the full scope of what they're generating a claim for, but not necessarily all the detail we want under that. EHRs can give us a lot of detail, but it might not cover the full scope unless you're in an integrated system. And so we're interested in some of these health information exchanges and other things to get as full a longitudinal and multidimensional view of what's happening to the patient, to put the medication and its effects into that context.
And Denitza, you talked explicitly about registry, electronic record, claims integration at bigger scale in collaboration with other agencies too. Actually, all of you mentioned the importance of CMS, for example, collaborations. Yeah.
So I would add the importance of interoperability efforts and the need for FDA to continue to work with the Office of the National Coordinator, with other sister agencies within HHS, to in fact bridge some of these gaps that exist in the way of how this data can actually move and affect fluidity of that data immensely. So I think one example that we are embarking on is in the space of temporomandibular joint disease, which is really a very serious disease, often neglected and treated only by dentists, but actually it's a complex disorder. And currently we are partnering with the National Academy of Sciences, with the Impact Initiative from NIH, and others to in fact try to build that national infrastructure and international as well. But again, the point of interoperability is the key, so then this data can in fact be much faster and better and less costly moving across the lines of silos.
All right, well, we are at the end of our time. We'd like to say, it's been interesting to see over the course of Sentinel how the initial efforts had very, quite different starting points because of issues around data and the nature of the products and the history that each of these centers were building on. But with this key theme coming out of this session around integration, I think there are going to be some more opportunities for integration across these programs and cross-learning. So it's really been a fascinating discussion. I want to thank you for all the ground you've covered and setting a tone and a framework along with Janet Woodcock for the details that we're going to get into as we go through the day. But before we get into those details, we are going to take a short break until 10:25, and then we will be reconvening here with Rachel Hendrick-Stirrup on the moderation for our next session. So thank you all very much, and thanks again to our presenters this morning.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mark.